Ruby, a young and strikingly beautiful woman, had just married into a family that seemed almost perfect. But when a quiet evening with her father-in-law takes an unexpected turn, she finds herself grappling with emotions she never anticipated. Can she hold on to the stability she thought she'd found, or will this connection pull her into uncharted territory? A story about beauty, boundaries, and the complexities of forbidden feelings. The sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the house in a warm, golden light as Ruby finished tidying the living room. At 26, she had recently married into a family that felt remarkably welcoming. Her father-in-law, Stewart, had been especially kind, making her feel at ease from the very beginning. In his early 50s, Stewart carried himself with a quiet confidence and vitality that naturally drew people to him. With her husband away for the weekend, Ruby found herself spending time alone with Stewart. Their conversations had always been easy, filled with humor and understanding, yet there was an unspoken tension beneath the surface, something neither of them had ever openly addressed. As Ruby put the last cushion in place, she glanced out the window and saw Stewart relaxing on the patio, a glass of lemonade in hand. On a whim, she decided to join him. A mix of excitement and nerves buzzed within her as she stepped outside. "Hey, Stewart, mind if I join you?" she called out, trying to keep her tone casual. "Not at all, Ruby. Please, have a seat," he said, gesturing to the chair beside him with his usual warmth. As she settled in, the evening's balmy air seemed to wrap around them. They chatted about small things, work, family, favorite shows, but there was an underlying energy between them that felt different. It wasn't something either could ignore. After a pause in the conversation, Stewart leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "You know, Ruby, you've really become an important part of this family. I'm grateful for that." His words, though kind, sent her heart racing. Ruby tried to convince herself it was just the natural charm he exuded, the same warmth that had made her feel so welcome in the family. Yet, deep down, she knew this moment felt different, charged with something unspoken. "Thank you, Stewart. That really means a lot," she replied softly, their eyes meeting for a moment that felt slightly too long. "It's just hard to believe how quickly time flies," he continued with a faint smile. "It feels like just yesterday you were meeting everyone for the first time." The sky shifted from gold to soft hues of pink and orange as the sun sank lower. Ruby felt a flutter in her stomach and shifted in her chair, trying to brush off the strange pull she felt toward him. "Would you like more lemonade?" Stewart asked suddenly, breaking the silence as he stood. "I can grab us another round from the kitchen." "Sure, that sounds great," she replied, grateful for the brief moment alone to gather her thoughts. As Stewart disappeared into the house, Ruby let out a deep breath, her mind racing. She couldn't deny there was something about him. His kindness, his quiet strength, the way he made her feel at ease, yet somehow exhilarated. She shook her head, willing herself to focus on the moment. As much as she wanted to ignore it, the growing closeness between them was undeniable. She couldn't decide if it was the absence of her husband, the serene evening, or the sheer kindness of Stewart that made her feel so drawn to him. But she knew these feelings were complicated, even dangerous. When Stewart returned, he handed her a glass, their fingers brushing for just an instant. Their fingers brushed briefly, a fleeting moment that left her heart racing. "It's getting a little chilly out here," Stewart said, his tone even. "Why don't we head inside?" "Sure," Ruby agreed, grateful for the change in setting but still acutely aware of the energy between them. The silence between them was thick, each step toward the house amplifying the questions racing through her mind. What was she doing? Why couldn't she look away from him? Even as they entered the warm glow of the living room, the tension didn't ease. It only grew. Inside, the atmosphere shifted. The quiet of the house seemed to amplify the closeness of their presence. They sat on the couch, the soft glow of a nearby lamp casting shadows that danced across the walls. For a while, neither of them spoke, the silence thick but not uncomfortable. Finally, Stewart broke it. "Ruby," he said quietly, his voice measured but serious. "Can I be honest with you?" "Of course," she replied, her heart pounding as she braced herself for what might come next. "I've been feeling something between us that I can't quite put into words," he confessed, his gaze steady. Ruby's breath caught in her throat. She hesitated, but the truth felt impossible to deny. "I felt it too," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I didn't know what to do about it." Stewart leaned closer, his eyes locking onto Ruby's with an intensity that sent her heart racing. "I don't want to make things uncomfortable, but I can't ignore how I feel anymore," he admitted, his voice low and steady. Ruby's breath caught as she met his gaze. "I don't want to ignore it either," she said softly, her voice tinged with nervous excitement. The air between them seemed to shift, becoming charged with something unspoken. Gently, Stewart reached out and tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, his gesture gentle and thoughtful. She found herself leaning into his touch, warmth blooming in her chest. "Can I tell you something honest?" he asked, his voice quiet but filled with intent. "Yes," she whispered, her heart racing at the thought of what he might say. Stewart leaned closer, their gazes locking in the dim light. "I can't ignore this connection we share," he said softly. His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, and Ruby found herself nodding, unable to speak, but understanding the depth of his confession. As their kiss lingered, Stewart's hands gently rested on her back, pulling her into a closer embrace. The warmth of his presence seemed to envelop her, and she felt an undeniable pull toward him. "Ruby," he murmured against her lips, his voice soft, yet brimming with emotion. "You have a way of making people feel special," he said softly, his voice filled with emotion. She smiled, feeling the weight of his words sink in. "That means a lot to me," she replied, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside her. Stewart's touch was careful and deliberate as his hands grazed her waist. He paused for a moment, looking into her eyes. "Is this okay?" he asked, his voice gentle. "Yes," she said, her confidence growing as she leaned into his touch. There was something electrifying about the moment, a connection that went beyond words. His hand brushed her arm lightly, the gesture filled with quiet care, as though he was searching for the right way to express what words couldn't. They sat together on the couch, their shared closeness feeling both exhilarating and natural. Ruby leaned back slightly, allowing the moment to unfold, her heart pounding in her chest. The quiet hum of the room seemed to amplify the emotions between them, every glance and touch heightening the energy they shared. "I've wanted to tell you this for so long," Stewart confessed, his voice breaking the silence as he pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. "But I didn't know how." "Me too," Ruby admitted, her cheeks warm as she found the courage to meet his gaze. There was a vulnerability in the moment that felt both terrifying and freeing. Their connection grew as the evening wore on, each touch and word weaving something unspoken yet undeniable between them. The soft glow of the lamp illuminated their faces, emphasizing the depth of their emotions. It was a moment of honesty and closeness that neither had expected but both felt drawn to embrace. As the night unfolded, Ruby felt a shift within herself. This was no longer just a fleeting moment of attraction or curiosity. It was something far deeper, something that would change the way she saw the world and her place in it. And as they sat together, lost in their conversation and closeness, she knew this was only the beginning of a path neither of them had anticipated but couldn't ignore. Stewart stepped closer, his gaze steady and filled with unspoken emotion. Ruby felt her breath catch as the space between them seemed to dissolve. For a moment, it felt as though the world had paused, leaving only the quiet connection they couldn't deny. Each kiss seemed to stoke the growing intensity of their connection, as though it had been waiting for this moment to unfold. "Ruby," Stewart whispered, pulling back just enough to meet her gaze. His expression was earnest, his voice tinged with vulnerability. "You have no idea how long I've wanted this." A playful smile danced on her lips as she leaned in closer. "I think I might," she replied, her tone light, but her eyes filled with unspoken emotion. She kissed him again, the rush of the moment taking her breath away. Her fingers wove into his hair as his arms cradled her, making her feel both secure and exhilarated. Stewart's hands moved to her waist, his touch both firm and careful. He drew her even closer, their bodies fitting together as though they belonged. Ruby let her hands explore his chest, her fingertips brushing against the fabric of his shirt and savoring the strength beneath. The world outside seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them and the unspoken bond that had been building between them. "You're incredible," Stewart murmured, his voice low as he pressed a gentle kiss to her temple. His words carried a sincerity that made her heart flutter. "So are you," Ruby whispered back, her voice barely audible but filled with meaning. She smiled, leaning into the closeness of the moment, feeling both the thrill of discovery and the comfort of his presence. Stewart's hand grazed her arm, tracing gentle patterns that sent shivers through her. "Let's take this slow," he said softly, his lips brushing against hers. "I want to savor every moment with you." Ruby nodded, her pulse quickening. There was something uniquely powerful about the care in his words, the way he seemed to treasure the moment as much as she did. "Me too," she replied, her voice steady but laced with emotion. As their kisses resumed, they deepened with a growing sense of trust and understanding. Ruby could feel the strength in Stewart's arms as he held her close, and the brief contact between them felt charged, adding a new layer to the unspoken tension. Every touch felt deliberate, meaningful, as though they were learning to navigate an uncharted yet exciting connection. The quiet of the room amplified the tenderness between them, the soft glow of the lamp illuminating their faces and highlighting the emotions that neither could put into words. When Stewart's hand gently brushed hers, Ruby felt an unspoken promise in the gesture, a connection that was as much about trust as it was about passion. As the evening stretched on, their bond grew stronger. Every touch, every glance, and every shared breath wove together, creating something deeply meaningful between them. Ruby knew this wasn't just a fleeting moment. It was the start of something transformative. The vulnerability they shared felt like a foundation, one they were building together with every word and every touch. For the first time, Ruby let herself fully embrace the closeness between them. She wasn't sure where this path would lead, but in that moment, she was certain of one thing. She wanted to explore it fully, step by step, with Stewart by her side. Ruby's relationship with her father-in-law, Stewart, continued in secret. At first, it felt intoxicating, a forbidden thrill that made her heart race every time they managed to find a moment alone. She found herself looking forward to the subtle glances they exchanged during family dinners, the brief, stolen conversations when no one else was around. The risk heightened everything. They grew adept at finding excuses to be alone, an errand only the two of them could run, a walk through the garden, a helping hand in the kitchen when Steward's wife needed rest. These moments filled Ruby with a dangerous mix of exhilaration and guilt. She couldn't deny the magnetic pull she felt toward him, but as their connection deepened, so did the weight of her unease. One evening, while her husband was still out of town, Ruby found herself alone with Steward again. This time, it wasn't just a fleeting kiss or an accidental touch. They crossed a line that left her trembling with both desire and shame. As Steward held her afterward, whispering how much she meant to him, Ruby couldn't help but feel a gnawing sense of dread. The next morning, as she prepared breakfast with her mother-in-law chatting cheerfully nearby, the guilt was unbearable. Ruby's hands shook as she flipped pancakes, her smile forced and her stomach churning. Every kind word from her mother-in-law felt like a dagger to her heart. How could she look this woman in the eye, knowing the betrayal she was committing? As the days passed, Ruby's internal conflict only grew worse. She started avoiding her husband's calls, terrified that he might somehow sense her infidelity through the phone. When he finally came home, his warm embrace and loving smile made her heart break. He was a good man, kind, attentive, and completely devoted to her. Ruby's shame began to manifest in small ways. She became irritable, snapping at her husband for minor things, or retreating into long silences. Her husband noticed, of course. "Is everything okay?" he asked one night as they lay in bed. "You've been distant lately." "I'm fine," she lied, forcing a smile. But inside, she was anything but fine. The clandestine moments with Steward became harder to enjoy. Every touch, every whispered word now carried a bitter edge. Ruby started to see the cracks in the fantasy. What was she doing? This wasn't love. It was obsession, a reckless chase for something that would only destroy her life. One evening, after another stolen kiss with Steward, Ruby drove aimlessly through the city, tears streaming down her face. She hated what she had become, a liar, a cheat, someone capable of betraying the people who loved her most. Her mind raced with questions she couldn't answer. Was it worth it? Was this who she wanted to be? What if her husband found out? What if her mother-in-law found out? She thought about the life she had with her husband, the future they had planned together. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And despite everything, she still loved him. The realization hit her like a tidal wave. She had to stop. The next morning, Ruby sat down with Steward in the garden. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled as she spoke. "Steward, we can't do this anymore. It's wrong. I've been lying to myself, to my husband, to everyone, and I can't keep living like this." He looked at her, his expression a mixture of sadness and longing. "Ruby, I don't want to lose you. You were never supposed to have me," she replied, tears filling her eyes. "This isn't love. It's a mistake, and it's hurting everyone, even if they don't know it yet. I have to save my marriage and myself." Ruby knew that simply ending things with Steward wasn't enough. The damage was already done, and she needed help to rebuild her life. She confessed to her husband, not the full affair, but enough for him to understand that she was struggling emotionally and that their marriage was in jeopardy. "I love you," she told him, tears streaming down her face. "But I've been lost. I need help. I want us to work, but I can't do it alone." Her husband, though hurt and confused, agreed to try. Together, they decided to move to a new city, a fresh start where Ruby could focus on healing. She started therapy, where she began to unravel the reasons behind her actions. Why had she sought validation from someone else? Why had she been willing to jeopardize everything? The process was painful, but it was also liberating. For the first time, Ruby confronted her insecurities, her need for attention, and the guilt that had consumed her. Therapy helped her see that what she had with Stewart wasn't love. It was an escape, a fantasy that couldn't survive in the real world. Months later, Ruby and her husband stood in their new apartment, unpacking boxes and laughing about their mismatched kitchenware. Things weren't perfect. There were still moments of tension and unspoken doubts, but they were working through it. Ruby felt hopeful for the first time in months. Looking out the window at the city skyline, she thought about Stewart. She hadn't seen or spoken to him since their last conversation. The memory still stung, but it no longer consumed her. She had made her choice, and she was determined to live by it. Ruby took her husband's hand and smiled. "I'm ready for this," she said. He squeezed her hand gently, his eyes filled with trust. "So am I." And with that, Ruby closed the door on her past, stepping into a future she was finally ready to face.